In the sweltering August of 1840, in the backlands of Alabama, there unfolded a scene so grotesque, so calculated, that even those who witnessed it swore never to speak of it again. A plantation owner, wealthy and respected by every man who shook his hand, turned the walls of his estate into a theater of cruelty. But the performance was not inflicted upon his slaves. It was inflicted by them at his command, and the victim was his own wife. Her crime? Adultery. But not in the way whispered scandals normally passed through the South. She had chosen her lovers from among the very men her husband owned. Enslaved men. And when word reached the master, he did not hide it. He did not silence it. He sharpened it into a weapon. He summoned his field hands, assembled them in the main yard under the burning sun, and dragged his wife before them, half-dressed, trembling, and desperate. He announced to all that she had betrayed her blood, her class, her God, and the punishment would not come from his hand. No, he would not dirty himself with her discipline. The ones she had chosen as partners in her sin would pass judgment. The very men she had laid with would be ordered to punish her publicly. Imagine the silence. Dozens of enslaved men staring at the woman who had both enticed and degraded them. Some carried shame, some anger, some confusion so deep it hollowed them out. They were given chains, whips, and knives, not as tools of rebellion, but as instruments of a twisted justice engineered by their owner. What happened next would fracture minds, corrupt loyalties, and leave scars no overseer could ever catalogue in a ledger. For it wasn't only about punishing her, it was about teaching them. A spectacle of control where humiliation and violence were fused into a message that would echo through every cabin, every field, every whisper of that plantation for decades. If you're listening to this, pause for a moment. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments, to seal this truth within yourself. And tell me where you're watching from, whether Alabama, Georgia, or far beyond. Because as you'll see in this story, geography may separate us, but corruption like this knows no borders. Hit subscribe, because this descent is only beginning, and what was revealed on that plantation yard in 1840 will change the way you look at power forever. When the order left his lips, a chill spread across the men gathered in that yard. Slaves who had been forced to endure whippings, beatings, and unspeakable degradations now stood paralyzed as their master commanded them to take the role of executioners. But this was no act of rebellion. It was a trap, designed to twist their humanity, to poison their conscience, to ensure that no matter what choice they made, they would never escape his grip. Think about it. If they refused to carry out the punishment, they would be branded as defiant, insubordinate, worthy of the lash or the noose. If they obeyed, they would be bound forever by the shame of what they had done, not just to a woman, but to themselves. Their chains were no longer made of iron. They were made of memory. His wife knelt in the dirt, her hair clinging to her face, her breath quick and shallow. She tried to appeal to him, not as master, not as husband, but as man. He turned away. This was not about justice. It was about performance. About control, about making sure every man and woman on that plantation understood you are not free, not even in your sins. I own your flesh, your secrets, your guilt. The first man was called forward. A whip was pressed into his hands. He looked at it as if it were a snake, alive and hissing. Every eye was on him, his fellow slaves, the overseers, the wife herself. His master. There was no way out. And so trembling he raised his arm. The crack of leather against skin echoed across the yard. It was not just her who cried out. It was him too, dying a little with every strike. One after another, they were summoned. Some struck quickly, trying to end it. Others hesitated until the overseer barked. The plantation owner watched with cold satisfaction, his face unreadable. He was not punishing adultery. He was orchestrating a ritual of domination, one that would bind everyone tighter to him. His wife became the offering. The slaves became unwilling priests. He, the master, stood as God over the whole affair. What you are hearing is not history written in schoolbooks. It is history written in blood and silence, and what comes next will prove that this wasn't a single act of cruelty, but a carefully crafted system of psychological warfare. By the time the last man was forced to strike, the air on that plantation was no longer heavy with heat. It was heavy with shame. No whip, no lash, no blade could inflict the kind of wound that now lived inside every soul present. His wife, broken, sobbing, and trembling in the dirt, was not the only one bleeding. Every man ordered to raise his hand against her carried the weight of his choice. And that, more than the punishment itself, was the true brilliance of the master's cruelty. You see, slavery was not sustained by iron chains alone. It was sustained by corruption of the spirit, by taking away every avenue of moral escape. This was not discipline, it was theater, a performance meant to divide, to contaminate. For the enslaved men, guilt became another form of bondage. For the wife, humiliation became her permanent brand. And for the onlookers, both black and white, it was a warning no secret was safe, no intimacy was beyond the reach of power. But here lies the darkest part of it all. The master was not simply punishing infidelity. He was reclaiming ownership over desire itself. His wife's betrayal had not only humiliated him, it had trespassed on what he considered his property, the bodies of the men she chose. By making them punish her, he was stamping his claim back onto them, reminding them that even in the act of her sin, he was still their God. Witnesses described the silence that followed as unbearable. No one dared move. The overseer shifted uneasily, the slaves stared at the ground, and the wife lay gasping like a discarded rag. Only the master stood tall, surveying the ruin he had orchestrated. And then, as if nothing more had occurred than the ringing of a dinner bell, he dismissed them. "Back to work," he said, as though he had not just carved scars into their very souls. The cotton fields swallowed them again, but nothing was the same. Every man who had lifted a whip against her would carry that image forever. Every woman in the quarters whispered about what it meant. That intimacy was no shield, that secrets could be weaponized. That in this world, love itself was owned. This was not the end. This was the beginning of a descent into even deeper cruelty, where punishment and pleasure would be fused into a spectacle few dared to remember aloud. That night, when the lamps were snuffed out and the plantation house sat in silence, the real storm began, not outside, but in the slave quarters. Men sat on their wooden bunks, staring at their hands as if they were cursed. The women, mothers and wives, searched their faces for answers they could not give. Children, too young to understand, sensed the tension and clung tighter to their mothers' skirts. No one spoke above a whisper. For the men forced to raise the whip, the shame was unbearable. Some wept quietly, their shoulders shaking in the darkness. Others clenched their fists, furious not only at the master, but at themselves. And yet what choice did they have? Refuse, and they would be whipped, hanged, or worse. Obey, and they betrayed not only a woman, but the last shreds of dignity left in their souls. That was the genius of it. The trap had no escape. The women whispered among themselves. Some spat bitterly, asking why their men hadn't resisted, why they hadn't shielded her. Others defended them, saying resistance would have only stacked corpses in the yard. But one truth echoed through every cabin: the master had poisoned them all. He had stolen even their unity, and what of the wife? She was returned to the plantation house, but her cries carried faintly into the night, drifting through the fields like a curse. The slaves heard her, and it cut them deeper than any overseer's lash. For they knew she would live, but her humiliation was endless, and so was theirs. The master's cruelty wasn't about the moment, it was about memory. By forcing those men to take part, he created a wound that would fester in the quarters forever. A wound that would split families, fuel suspicion, and make sure no slave could ever look at another without remembering what had been done. This was his control. Not just in the whip, not just in the chains, but in the mind. By turning men against a woman, and women against their men, he didn't just command bodies. He commanded loyalty, trust, and desire. He had reached into their most private selves and branded them there. And in the silence of that night, one thing became clear: he was not finished. This was only the opening act of something darker, something that would drag every soul on that plantation deeper into a theater of cruelty that blurred punishment, pleasure, and power into one. Inside the grand house, where chandeliers still gleamed and portraits of ancestors stared down from gilded frames, the wife sat alone in the parlor. Her body bore the marks of the day, the welts across her back, the bruises blooming across her skin. But her torment was deeper than flesh. Every whisper she had once traded in secrecy with the men from the quarters, every fleeting thrill of forbidden touch, now stood exposed under the harshest light imaginable. And worst of all, it was her husband who had orchestrated it. He had not killed her, he had not banished her. He had done something far worse. He had transformed her into a living monument of humiliation. Every step she took through that house, every glance from a servant, every silent smirk from an overseer reminded her that she was no longer mistress of this estate. She was a spectacle, reduced to a lesson. What do you think she felt in that moment? Guilt? Yes, shame, without question. But beneath it there was something else, fury, not only at her husband for his cold cruelty, but at herself for daring to believe she could have secrets in a world where her husband's reach extended into every breath she took. She realized then that her body had never been hers, not in marriage, not in sin, not even in punishment. She was property too. Servants passed the door, casting sidelong glances. They knew what had been done to her, and each look cut her deeper, because she knew that in their eyes she was no longer mistress, but object. An example of her husband's dominance, proof that even she could be broken like the rest. She stared into the parlor mirror that night and did not recognize the woman staring back. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, her eyes hollow. But deeper still, she saw the mark her husband had carved into her soul. She was not simply disgraced, she was remade, molded into a tool of his control. Her humiliation would outlive her wounds. It would travel through whispers, through glances, through the unspoken terror that she embodied. And perhaps that was his truest aim, not just to punish her, but to make her the ghost that haunted every other woman, every other man, reminding them that nothing was beyond his reach. The days that followed did not soften the horror of what had been done. Instead, the master found ways to sharpen it, to keep the wound raw. He understood something about power that most men never grasp. Punishment fades, but ritual burns itself into the soul. And so, he began to weave her disgrace into the very rhythm of plantation life. He made no effort to hide her from the eyes of the enslaved. Quite the opposite. He paraded her. When she passed through the yard, he forced her to walk with her head uncovered, her back exposed to show the scarves. When meals were served, she sat stiffly at the long table while slaves moved around her, their eyes avoiding her yet always seeing her. Her shame was not private, it was staged. And he went further. He called upon the men who had whipped her not once, but again and again. Sometimes to serve in the house, sometimes to stand silently in the parlor while she poured tea, sometimes to assist her with trivial tasks. Each encounter was its own performance. She, trembling, forced to meet their eyes. They, bound by guilt, forced to look upon the woman they had struck. It was not about labor, it was about memory. In the evenings, when he hosted guests, planters, overseers, even clergy, he dropped veiled remarks about her corrections. He let the rumors circulate freely. Some laughed nervously. Others shook their heads in mock pity. But all of them understood the message. His authority was so absolute, so unshakable, that even his own wife was not beyond being broken. For the slaves, this was more devastating than the lash. Every man in the quarters knew that he had been made a pawn. Every woman knew that desire, intimacy, even the sanctuary of secrecy, could be turned into a weapon against them. And for the wife, the humiliation never ended. Each day was another act in a theater of degradation that her husband directed with precision. This was not simply cruelty, it was art. He was crafting an eternal reminder that on his plantation, no one's body, no one's secrets, no one's soul belonged to themselves. All of it belonged to him. And deep down, the slaves began to understand this was not punishment for sin. This was a new form of slavery, slavery of the mind. Back in the quarters, whispers moved like smoke. Every night after the day's labor, when the fields fell silent and the cabins filled with flickering lamplight, the story of the mistress's punishment took new shape. Some swore she had begged the men to love her. Others claimed she had bewitched them, using her touch like poison. But beneath the rumors, one truth burned steady: the master had shattered something far more important than flesh. He had shattered trust. The men who had struck her were marked, not by scars but by suspicion. Their wives eyed them differently, wondering if the punishment was the first act of betrayal or the last. Other slaves avoided them, fearing the master might use them again, make them instruments of another humiliation. Some even whispered they had enjoyed it, That maybe they had wanted to hurt her. Lies, yes, but lies with power. Lies that grew. The women whispered too. If she could be broken, what of us? Some clutched their children tighter, fearful that tomorrow it could be their own secret dragged into the open yard, their own shame paraded before the world. They began to sleep lighter, speak softer, live in constant dread that even their most private selves were under watch. The master had achieved what no lash alone could. He had planted suspicion like seed. Now, when the slaves looked at one another, they did not see brothers, sisters, allies. They saw threats. They saw reminders of what had been done. He had made them afraid not only of him, but of each other. And what of the men who carried the guilt? They became silent, withdrawn, consumed by shame. Some turned violent in small ways, snapping at wives, striking children, desperate to unload the weight they carried. Others grew quiet, broken, unable to look anyone in the eye. The master had turned them into shadows of themselves, men enslaved not only by chains but by memory. This was the brilliance of his cruelty. A single act in the yard had multiplied into 1,000 silent wounds. Wounds that could not heal, wounds that divided the quarters, wounds that made rebellion impossible because unity had been poisoned. And all the while from the grand house above he watched, smiling, knowing the plantation no longer ran only on labor, it ran on fear, guilt, and suspicion. It was not enough for him to punish her once. It was not enough for him to let whispers fester in the quarters. No, this man understood that power thrived not in silence, but in repetition. And so he began to stage his wife like an actress in a theater of shame, forcing her to perform her disgrace again and again, each time in new and more calculated ways. There were evenings when he called the very men who had whipped her into the parlor, commanding them to stand in silence while she poured their drinks, while she served them bread, while she bowed her head under their gaze. Imagine the torment, her hands trembling as she placed the glass before a man who had struck her, the memory of the lash burning between them, her husband's cold eyes watching from the corner. This was not hospitality. It was ritual humiliation repeated like a prayer. At times he invited his guests, planters, overseers, trusted neighbors, to witness these twisted performances. She would be paraded before them, her scars displayed as proof of his dominion. Some men laughed, some looked away, some whispered behind their hands. But all of them left with the same thought. This was a master who ruled so completely that even his wife was nothing more than an object in his theater of control. The slaves, too, were pulled into these rituals. He summoned them into the house for tasks they never should have been given, standing watch, holding candles, polishing the floor beneath her feet as she was forced to sit before them in silence. He knew what he was doing. Each encounter deepened the wound, kept the memory fresh, ensured that her humiliation became a constant shadow over their lives. And the wife, she withered. Each staged act stripped more from her. Her dignity, her identity, her will. Once mistress of the estate, she was now reduced to nothing more than a symbol. A reminder to every eye that power belonged to him alone. Understand this, the master was not merely cruel. He was deliberate. He turned her shame into a tool sharper than any whip, stronger than any chain. He made her living proof that no one, not even the highest woman in his house, could escape his hand, and soon he would take it even further, blurring the line between punishment and entertainment until the plantation itself became a stage of nightmares. It happened on a night when the lamps in the great hall blazed brighter than the moon outside. The master had invited neighbors, fellow planters, and even a local reverend to dine with him. The table groaned with food, roasted game, sweet breads, wine flowing like water. But the feast was not the main event. The real performance came after. When the plates were cleared and laughter rang through the air, he clapped his hands. The room fell still. His wife was brought forward, her dress cut low enough to reveal the scars across her back, scars that had not yet faded from the punishment in the yard. Gasps murmured through the hall. Some men smirked behind their cups, others shifted uncomfortably, but none dared to speak. Then he commanded her to kneel, right there, on the polished floor, in front of planter, overseer, and preacher alike. He summoned the very slaves who had struck her weeks before. They entered the hall in silence, their heads bowed, their bodies stiff. Imagine the torment. for them to stand before white guests in the master's house, not as men, not as rebels, but as unwilling instruments of her continued humiliation. He made them circle her not to strike this time, but to stand as witnesses, reminders of the disgrace that had bound them all. "Here," he said to his guests, "is proof that sin brings ruin, proof that authority must never waver." His words dripped with self-righteous venom, wrapping his cruelty in the guise of morality. The reverend gave a solemn nod. The overseers chuckled uneasily. The guests whispered that they had never seen such discipline, such mastery, and the slaves, they stood frozen, their hearts split in two, shame on one side, fury on the other. For in that moment they were forced to acknowledge not only her disgrace, but their own role in it. And she, his wife, knelt trembling, eyes downcast, every heartbeat a reminder that she was no longer a woman but a living sermon, a warning, a spectacle. This was more than punishment. It was entertainment cloaked in righteousness. And it worked. Those who witnessed it carried the tale outward, spreading his legend as a man who ruled without weakness. On his plantation, sin did not simply end in silence. It was displayed, dissected, and made into a show. What he built that night was not just fear. It was theater. Theater designed to enslave both body and soul. Stories travel faster than wagons, faster than letters, faster than the truth itself. By the next week, whispers of what had happened in that great hall began to circulate across neighboring plantations. Men who had been present retold the spectacle in hushed tones, careful to frame it as a lesson, not entertainment. But the undertone of fascination could not be hidden. Some planters admired him. They said he had shown rare courage, that he had proved himself a man who allowed no weakness under his roof. To bring his wife low before slaves and masters alike, they muttered, was to demonstrate authority few could match. For them it was not cruelty, it was genius. A reminder that order, once shaken, must be restored with force so severe that no one dared challenge it again. But others recoiled. They whispered that he had gone too far, that a man who humiliated his own wife in front of both slave and free was playing with fire. Some feared it would incite rebellion, others feared it would invite scandal. Yet even in their condemnation there was awe, for whether they approved or not, every man who heard the tale understood one thing clearly. This master had carved a new path in the art of control. The reverend, who had nodded solemnly at the scene, carried the story to his congregation under the guise of moral instruction. He preached that sin brings public ruin, that order must be maintained at any cost. But behind his words lingered a darker truth. He had witnessed cruelty cloaked in righteousness, and he had blessed it with scripture. Meanwhile, in the quarters across the county, slaves who caught wind of the tale felt the weight of it settle on their shoulders. They whispered that if a mistress could be brought low, none were safe. If intimacy itself could be turned into punishment, then every desire was a potential snare. Fear thickened, distrust spread. The master's cruelty extended beyond his own gates, seeping into the soil of the South like poison. Understand this: the event was not confined to one plantation. It became legend, a dark legend whispered by planters with admiration and by slaves with dread. And in both whispers the master's power grew. What began as punishment had become myth, and myths, unlike wounds, never fade. Inside the house, her presence began to change. She was no longer the mistress who walked with confidence, issuing commands to servants, hosting guests with a smile fixed on her face. That woman was gone. What remained was a shadow. She moved quietly through the halls, her head lowered, her footsteps barely audible on the polished wood floors. Those who saw her whispered that she had become something less than living, a figure who drifted, hollow-eyed, as though part of her soul had already been buried. Her husband ensured it. He forbade her the privacy of dignity. When guests visited, she was brought forward silent, like a living relic of sin. When slaves served in the parlor, he kept her near, a constant reminder of what awaited any who dared betray him. Even her clothing changed. Simple gowns, thin fabric that revealed the lash marks still etched across her back. She was forced to wear her punishment like a crown of thorns, displayed again and again, until she herself believed she was nothing more than a symbol. Servants in the house began to avoid her gaze, not out of respect but out of discomfort. They whispered that when you looked into her eyes, you saw only emptiness. Some swore she muttered to herself when alone, fragments of prayers or pleas or curses. No one could tell which. Others claimed she no longer slept, pacing her chamber in the dead of night, her candlelight flickering against the drapes like a restless spirit. The slaves in the quarters began to call her the ghost of the big house, not because she was dead, but because she was no longer truly alive. Her humiliation had hollowed her out, leaving only a vessel of suffering, wandering the plantation like a warning carved into flesh. And her husband, he fed off it. To him, her silence was victory, her emptiness proof of his mastery. He had not only broken her body, he had stolen her soul and reshaped it into something that served his control. She was no longer wife, no longer mistress. She was his lesson, his example, his eternal reminder that power could reach deeper than blood and bone. In breaking her, he had created something worse than death, a woman who breathed but no longer belonged to herself. It was not enough for him to silence her, not enough to parade her brokenness before the eyes of slaves and neighbors. No, the master's cruelty demanded ritual. He began to turn her humiliation into something structured, repeated, almost ceremonial. Nights became darker than the day, not because of the absence of light, but because of what he forced her to endure behind closed doors. He would summon her not as a wife, but as property. He stripped the word marriage of meaning, leaving only obedience and display. At times he forced her to stand in front of others, slaves, sometimes overseers, and made her recite her failures aloud, confessing imagined sins as though she were in a twisted church. Her voice would tremble, but he demanded clarity. Every stammer was met with a blow, every pause punished until the words flowed like blood from her lips. And when the confessions were finished, he turned what should have been intimacy into another stage of power. He did not touch her as a man touches his wife. He commanded her, directed her, forced her to respond to his desire as though it were law. And worse, he made others watch. Sometimes the house slaves, sometimes a trusted overseer. Always an audience, always witnesses. He believed that shame multiplied when it was seen, when eyes bore down upon her, when her body was no longer her own, but a theater of humiliation. This was not passion, it was ritual domination. Each act blurred the lines between punishment and possession until even she could no longer tell where pain ended and violation began. He told her that this was her purpose, that her existence had been reduced to an eternal cycle of confession, obedience, and display. The slaves who watched were forced into silence, but in whispers in the shadows they spoke of it. Some said she no longer resisted at all, that she moved like a puppet, her spirit gone. Others claimed her silence was not surrender, but hatred brewing in stillness, a hatred so deep it could not be spoken. Either way, the plantation learned one lesson. The master did not simply own the land, the slaves, and the wealth. He owned the body of his wife, her shame, her very soul, and he would use her to remind all who watched that power, once seized, could twist every sacred bond into a weapon. The slaves did not speak openly. They never could. Words carried in the wind could be overheard, and a single misplaced phrase might lead to the whip or the noose. But in the dark corners of the quarters, in whispers drowned beneath the hum of insects and the creak of the trees, they shared what they had seen. To them, the mistress was no longer simply a woman. She was something else, something caught between victim and omen. Her cries, muffled behind walls, seeped into the night like a haunting. They heard her voice carried through the stillness, rising and breaking like the howl of a trapped spirit. And the men forced to watch her humiliation with their own eyes, felt as though they had been drawn unwillingly into a ritual of corruption. Some said her suffering was deserved, that she, too, was complicit in the master's cruelty, that she had once wielded the whip herself. To them, what they witnessed was merely the turning of fate, but others whispered of curses. They said the master's obsession with breaking her had gone beyond cruelty. It had angered forces older than him, forces that watched from the trees, from the soil, from the sky itself. The men told one another that every lash he laid upon her flesh, every humiliation he staged, called down a reckoning. The plantation, they said, was becoming poisoned. Crops would wither, storms would rise. Children born under this roof would carry the stain of what had been done here. They believed the mistress herself, broken and hollowed, had become a vessel of that curse. walking proof that the master had invited damnation into his own house. And so, when the men were forced to stand in silence as witnesses to her torment, they did not merely see her suffering. They saw omens. They saw signs. They saw the plantation sliding into a darkness that could not be undone. For them, every night was not just survival. It was participation in a ritual they had not chosen. They were trapped inside a theater of cruelty, forced to play roles in a drama where humiliation was power and silence was the price of life. But beneath that silence, something stirred. For every slave who believed she was cursed, there was another who believed she was a symbol, that her brokenness revealed the master's weakness. If he had to destroy his own wife to feel powerful, perhaps he was not as untouchable as he appeared. The whispers grew into two camps, those who feared her suffering as a curse, and those who saw it as a sign of his eventual ruin. Either way, they knew one truth: the walls of that plantation no longer held just wealth and order. They held rot, they held shadows, and the shadows were spreading. Whispers spread beyond the quarters. They slipped through cracks in the walls, carried by servants who traveled between houses, by traders who lingered too long, by overseers who couldn't keep secrets forever. Soon the neighboring plantations began to murmur. Something was wrong at that house. Something unnatural. Visitors noticed it first. They came expecting the proud display of Southern order, neatly kept grounds, a warm table, the charm of hospitality, masking the brutality beneath. But what they found was different. The air itself felt heavier. The house seemed to hold its breath, its shutters like half-closed eyes watching with suspicion. Even the slaves moved differently here, quieter, sharper, as though carrying burdens too heavy to name. And then there was the mistress. Once known for her beauty, for her poise at gatherings, she now appeared pale, distant, drained of presence. Some saw her at church, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed on nothing. Others claimed she no longer spoke at all in public, that she had been hollowed out, a ghost wandering in daylight. But what disturbed outsiders most was the master himself. He seemed restless, agitated. His voice, once commanding with measured authority, now carried the edge of a man straining to keep order within himself. Neighbors who shared his table remarked on his short temper, his erratic stories, the way his eyes darted toward his wife with something closer to obsession than affection. And when her hand trembled while lifting a glass, when her lips hesitated before a word, guests felt a silent tension so thick it made the room colder. Rumors began to bloom. Some whispered that the mistress had gone mad. Others claimed she was possessed. A few dared to suggest that the master himself had lost his mind, though such talk was dangerous. Whatever the cause, all agreed that the plantation no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place under siege from within, and nature seemed to echo this unease. The fields, once bountiful, showed signs of decline. A sudden blight touched the corn, storms struck harder, and lightning split a tree that had stood untouched for decades. Animals grew restless. Dogs barked at shadows, horses spooked at nothing. To the enslaved, it was confirmation of the curse. To the neighbors, it was evidence that something unholy lingered in that house. The plantation was no longer simply the site of cruelty. It was becoming a story, a legend whispered across porches and pews, a cautionary tale of a man who had broken not only his slaves, not only his wife, but the balance of the world itself. And the more people talked, the more the master clung to his rituals of domination. He believed he was proving his strength. But to outsiders, it looked like desperation, as though he were fighting an invisible force that had already begun to consume him. At first, her silence seemed like surrender. A woman hollowed out, emptied by humiliation until she no longer resisted, no longer spoke, no longer moved except when commanded. The master believed he had broken her completely. He mistook stillness for weakness, but silence, in its truest form, can be a weapon, and soon even he began to sense it. She stopped crying. That was the first sign. Once, her voice had filled the nights with sobs, confessions, muffled screams that carried into the quarters. But now, nothing, no sound at all. He would demand her confessions, and she would stare at him with wide, unblinking eyes. He would strike her, and her body would not flinch. It was as though pain no longer touched her, as though he had beaten her past the point of breaking into some other state entirely. The slaves whispered that she had become a vessel, emptied of herself, and filled with something else. Some said she had called upon the spirits of the dead. Others believed she had gone beyond madness into a place where no man's control could reach. Whatever the truth, her silence unnerved even those who despised her, for there was power in it. Raw, unsettling power. The master noticed it most during his rituals of domination. Where once she trembled and wept, now she simply watched. Her gaze followed him, steady and cold, as though measuring him, stripping him bare in ways he could not endure. He tried to force her to speak, to scream, to beg. But the more he tried, the less she gave, and in that absence, his authority began to falter. For the first time, the master seemed unsettled in his own house. His punishments grew harsher, more erratic, as though he believed violence could reclaim the fear her silence had stolen from him. But each strike landed against an immovable wall. Her body bled, but her eyes never wavered, and he began to realize he had not broken her. He had created something else. The enslaved men noticed the change too. They saw in her the outline of a woman who was no longer merely a victim, but an omen. Her silence became its own language, carrying the weight of every cruelty endured. They began to say she was waiting for a moment, waiting for a reckoning. The master had turned his wife into a symbol without realizing it. He thought he had destroyed her spirit. But in trying to strip her of everything, he had given her a new kind of power, the kind that grows in stillness, the kind that does not lash out immediately but waits, coiling like a serpent in the dark. And in that waiting, a truth began to emerge. The master had more to fear from her silence than he ever had from her screams. Fear, once it takes root, grows faster than any crop, and soon the master's fear of his wife began to choke him like a vine twisting around his throat. He had spent years turning her into an object of humiliation, yet now, when she should have been utterly broken, he found himself the one unsettled, watching her silence like a shadow that would not move. At night, he could no longer sleep. He would pace the halls, his boots echoing across the wooden floors, candle in hand, as though expecting something to emerge from the darkness. He often paused at her door listening, not for cries, there were none, but for the silence itself, the unbearable weight of it pressing through the walls. Sometimes he thought he heard whispering where there was none, a low murmur slipping beneath the door like smoke. When he burst in, she would be sitting motionless, staring at him as though she had been waiting. The master began to imagine eyes upon him everywhere. At the table, her still gaze made his hand tremble as he lifted his glass. In the fields, when he surveyed the crops, he felt the eyes of the slaves watching him differently. Less with fear, more with expectation, as though waiting for him to falter. Even in church, when scripture was read, he swore the words turned against him, twisting in his ears to speak of judgment and betrayal. His temper worsened. He lashed out at overseers for minor mistakes, beat slaves for imagined insolence, shouted at his wife as though words could pierce her silence. But nothing restored the power he had once felt. The rituals of domination that once fed his pride now only deepened his unease. The more he struck her, the less human she seemed. The more he demanded her voice, the heavier the silence became. Neighbors began to notice. They spoke of the master's pallor, his restless eyes, the way his hand shook when he lifted his hat in greeting. Some said he had grown thinner, haunted by sleeplessness. Others whispered that he was going mad, eaten alive not by enemies or illness, but by something inside his own house. The slaves saw it more clearly. They whispered that the mistress's silence had turned into a mirror, reflecting his corruption back upon him until he could no longer stand the sight of himself. He had tried to break her spirit, but instead he had fed her a power he could not name. And though he would never admit it aloud, even he felt it, the balance had shifted. He was no longer the unquestioned master of his own home. He was a man hunted by silence, hunted by the very woman he believed he had destroyed. Paranoia is a hunger that can never be fed. Once it takes hold, it gnaws at everything. And soon the master's fear began to spread beyond his wife. The silence he could not conquer in her eyes infected the way he saw everyone around him. He no longer trusted his overseers, his neighbors, not even the slaves whose obedience had once been absolute. Every look, every whisper, every pause in conversation seemed to him like a secret plot. His punishments grew savage. A misplaced tool in the fields, a delay in serving supper, a glance held too long. All became reasons for the whip, reasons for blood. He beat his slaves not to enforce order, but to silence the voices he imagined behind their eyes. He wanted to believe that cruelty could restore the control slipping from his hands. But each lash only deepened their quiet defiance, their certainty that he was unraveling. Even his overseers grew uneasy. They had once respected his authority. But now they whispered of his madness, of the way he ranted late into the night about curses and betrayal. Some reported seeing him stalk the halls with pistol in hand, muttering that someone was coming for him, though no one ever did. Others claimed he had begun to pray aloud in fits of rage, demanding God strike down his enemies, only to fall silent when he realized he no longer knew who those enemies were. The neighbors noticed too. Invitations to his house grew fewer, and those who came left disturbed by his restless talk, his sudden eruptions of anger. Whispers of scandal spread through town that the mistress had gone insane, that the slaves had turned rebellious, that the plantation was cursed. And though no one spoke it aloud in his presence, many began to wonder how long a man could rule when even his own house seemed to reject him. But through it all, his wife remained silent. She did not flinch when he raged. She did not move when he struck. She sat and watched and carried that unbearable stillness like a crown. To the slaves, she had become more than a woman. She was the shadow over the master's mind, the ghost sitting at his table, the silent storm that grew larger every day. And with each outburst, each punishment, each sleepless night, the master himself seemed to wither. He no longer looked like the towering figure of wealth and control. He looked like a man hunted not by rebellion, not by enemies in the flesh, but by something he had created himself. The plantation no longer felt like a place ruled by order. It felt like a powder keg. Every lash of the whip, every suspicious glance, every sleepless whisper tightening the rope around the master's own neck. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. The question was no longer if the house would collapse, it was how. The breaking point did not arrive with thunder. It came quietly like a spark in dry grass. One evening, after days without sleep, the master called the slaves into the main hall. His eyes were sunken, his hands trembling, his face slick with the sweat of a man who no longer trusted his own shadow. He accused them, accused everyone, of conspiring with his wife against him. The room was tense, the air heavy. The slaves stood rigid, silent, eyes lowered, knowing that any word could become a death sentence. His wife sat in her chair, still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not blink. She did not move. She only watched. And her silence, more than any denial, ignited the fire in him. He screamed that she had bewitched the house, that she had poisoned the air, that her silence itself was an act of rebellion. His words tumbled out with the madness of a man who no longer knew the difference between thought and reality. He demanded she confess, not only to betrayal, but to witchcraft, to curses, to all the storms and failures that plagued his land. When she refused, when she simply stared at him with those hollow, steady eyes, he snapped. The master struck her before them all, harder than ever before, his rage spilling into a frenzy of blows. But even then, she did not scream, she did not beg. She absorbed his fury like stone absorbs the storm. And in that stillness, in that refusal to give him the sound of surrender, something inside him broke completely. He drew his pistol. Gasps filled the hall. The slaves froze, trapped between the instinct to run and the knowledge that movement meant death. His hand shook violently, the weapon aimed at the woman who had once been his wife, his possession, his ritual of control. And yet, she remained calm, staring into him as though she were already beyond his reach. What happened next would become a story no one could forget. Some swore he pulled the trigger, only to find the gun misfired. Others claimed his hand turned against him, that in his madness he shot himself instead. There were even whispers that he fell before ever firing, struck down by forces unseen. Whatever the truth, one fact was undeniable: the master's reign ended that night. His power, his authority, his fragile grip on the plantation, all shattered in a single moment of violence he could not control. The slaves did not cheer. They did not move. They simply watched, the weight of years of silence pressing down upon them. For in that instant they knew the house itself had reached its reckoning. And the woman The wife who had endured his rituals, his humiliations, his fury, sat in silence still, not broken, not destroyed, but something else entirely. The night after his fall, the plantation seemed to hold its breath. No one moved quickly, no one raised their voice. The slaves walked softly, as though afraid to disturb something sacred in the air. The overseers, pale and uncertain, lingered at the edges of the property, waiting for instructions that would never come. For the first time in memory, the master's voice did not thunder through the halls. His absence was louder than his presence had ever been. The slaves who had stood in the hall that night told different versions of what they saw. Some swore he had shot himself, driven mad by his own paranoia. Others insisted the weapon misfired, that the curse had turned his violence back upon him. A few whispered in tones too quiet to carry, that the mistress herself had done nothing but stare, and that her silence had killed him. But one detail remained constant in every retelling: she did not speak. Not before, not during, not after. She sat in that same chair, her posture unbroken, her gaze steady, as if she had been waiting for this ending all along. The overseers debated whether to seize control, to step in and claim authority over the plantation. But even they hesitated. Something about the house felt different now, something unspoken that made men cautious. To raise their voice against her, to lay a hand upon her, seemed dangerous, as though the silence itself might rise up against them. The slaves, however, understood what the overseers could not. They whispered that her silence had become the final blow, the weapon that broke the master's mind until it devoured him. And in their eyes, she was no longer merely a woman, she was a symbol, a vessel of vengeance, a ghost that walked among the living, proof that cruelty could never reign forever without reaping its own destruction. Neighbors soon learned of the incident. Rumors spread like fire that the master had lost his mind, that the wife had bewitched him, that the plantation was cursed. Some believed the family line itself was damned. Others feared even setting foot on the property, as though the soil carried a sickness of the spirit. And yet, behind all the speculation, one truth became clear: no man, however powerful, could humiliate, degrade, and destroy without eventually being consumed by the very forces he unleashed. The mistress did not leave. She remained in the house, her silence deeper than ever. But now, that silence was not seen as weakness. It was feared, it was revered, it was legend. And in the quarters, under the cover of night, the enslaved whispered one phrase again and again, a phrase that carried more power than chains or whips. The silence killed him. The master's death should have ended the story. His land divided, his house left to the care of distant relatives, the plantation absorbed into the machinery of southern wealth. But what happened within those walls did not fade with his burial. It lingered, it clung. The slaves carried it first. They whispered of the mistress, not as a broken wife, not as a victim, but as a spirit, one who had endured the unendurable, who had turned silence into a blade sharper than any whip. They said she haunted the halls, her stillness pressing against the hearts of anyone who dared to speak too loudly. For them, she was proof that cruelty devours itself, that even the most powerful man can be undone, not by rebellion, not by force, but by the very silence he tried to command. The neighbors carried it too. They told stories in low voices, warning their children not to marry for power, not to strip humanity from the ones closest to them. They said that house was cursed, that no laughter would ever sound natural there again, that every window looked like an unblinking eye watching for another man foolish enough to believe he could master what should never be mastered. And as decades passed, the tale twisted and spread. Some claimed the mistress never spoke another word until her dying breath. Others said she vanished one night, leaving only an empty chair and a silence so deep it rang in the ears. Still others swore her figure could be seen by travelers on certain nights, standing at the window, gazing out across the land where her life had been stolen, her voice turned to a weapon more enduring than steel. But no matter how the details shifted, one truth remained the same. The plantation became a graveyard not just for its master, but for the illusion of his power. His whips rotted, his rituals crumbled, his name faded into dust. Yet her silence, her refusal to give him what he wanted most, outlived him. And so the story passed through time, whispered in quarters, retold in churches, murmured in kitchens and fields, a warning, an omen, a truth men tried to bury but could never silence. For in the end, it was not rebellion nor blade, nor fire that brought him down. It was silence, and silence, once born of suffering, once sharpened by cruelty, becomes the loudest voice of all.